All right, guys. All right, I'm wired on. Thanks for coming. So today we're going to talk about account setup for successful selling. So I've been with eBay a little over 5 years now, and a lot of the time I've been here has been working with business sellers and bringing them onto the platform and getting their inventory up and running. So that's a bit of my background. To start off, I'm gonna share an experience with one of the sellers I've brought on a few years ago. So a few years ago, I walked into Bulo Shoes. They're a shoe store in San Francisco. Anyone familiar with that area might know them, or your wives might. I walked in there and they weren't selling on eBay at the time. So I walked in and I convinced them, hey, eBay is a good channel for you. You've got great inventory. You should bring it on eBay. So the first thing we did was to get them to sign in and authenticate with the app that we were using at the time. So far, so good. We had them select some inventory to upload from their existing catalog, and bam, we hit an error. And the first error was because they had signed in with a buyer account. They didn't have a seller account yet, right? Can't create listings unless we have a seller account. After that, we started hitting some other errors around not having all the item specifics needed for the category they were selling in. We also had some issues with, they were surprised by some insertion fees because they didn't have a store subscription to take advantage of the promos we have there. And so the quote at the top there was from the manager who I was working with, wow, why is this so hard, right? So that leads me to my topic for the day. What are the steps and best practices when onboarding a new user to your platform? And the goal is to sort of anticipate and address issues before sellers hit them, right? So there's some things we can do via APIs and some steps in an onboarding platform to try and get ahead of the problems before they happen. So what I'm going to do today is I've got an example flow we're going to walk through, and as we go through each step, we'll talk through how that helps improve the experience. But before we do that, I want to show this slide to you. I'm not going to read these to you because you guys have seen these numbers like multiple times in the last couple of days, right? But I want to stress that we should use these numbers if you can. Like, do the pitch for eBay as a channel, right? You guys are the interface, the first experience sometimes these sellers are having with eBay, and so enticing them onto the platform, these numbers can help. And we have more numbers than this. If you need them, please reach out to us, and we'll help you with that. All right. So let's say you've given them the pitch. They're sold on eBay as a channel. You have them sign in and register. They've authenticated. So this is the example setup flow. And you don't have to read all of this. We're going to go through each of these steps in the remaining slides. But just take note, we're kind of following the journey from initial authentication to creating the first listing. So the first few steps here in our flow is about getting account info. So I'm talking specifically about our new account API here. We can, and some of this stuff is available in the legacy API as well, but the first thing I recommend getting is seller privileges. So the example I just gave you of Bulo Shoes signing in with a buyer account, could have prevented that if we had checked to see if they were a seller ahead of time, right? Instead of crashing into an error, we could have checked to see if they were a seller first. And if they weren't, we can send them to a URL on eBay, which will send them into the account upgrade flow. So they go from a buyer to a seller. We're also going to pull down seller limits and store subscription, which we will use in later checks. Since this is a developer conference, figured I should show you some code. This is from the new account API. You can see it's a simple get call with a nice, clean JSON response. And this is all documented online, so you don't have to write this down. All right, so the next step in our mock flow here is opting into programs. So again, via the account API, we can opt into business policies, out-of-stock control, eBay guaranteed delivery. So business policies, for those who don't know, are defaults that you can set across listings or subset of listings for payments, returns, and shipping. Opting into business policies and setting up business policies are a requirement for using the inventory API. out of stock control, for those who don't know, it can be very beneficial for sellers because when you've turned this on, if your inventory quantity goes to 0, the listing stays live. It's hidden from search and hidden from stores, but the listing can be maintained. You preserve all the transaction history, and when it comes back into stock, you simply add quantity again, and it pops back up in search. Right, I think we're doing that automatically with the inventory API stuff, but if you're doing some sort of a hybrid, right, it's important to set that. eBay Guaranteed Delivery is new for everybody. Hopefully you've got some questions answered about that in some of the forums and everything. If you have questions afterwards, please ask me. I'll do my best. But just know that you can opt in via this program. We'll talk a little bit about it again in a later slide. Yeah. Okay. So the question, just to repeat it so everyone can hear, is there are opt-ins for other programs that I didn't list here. Are they available? I don't think they are today, but I think it's on the roadmap. So let's go talk to the subject matter experts after this, and hopefully we can get that question answered. I called out the bottom here platform notifications as well. It's certainly not a requirement, but there are benefits to doing so. You can, via platform notifications, get notifications when an order event happens, when a member-to-member message happens. You can really improve your user experience by listening for these events and surfacing it to the user within your own tools and platforms. All right, moving on. Oh, this is the again, some code for you. The account API opting into the programs. As you can see, very simple payload. All right, so the next step in our flow is more about the UI, so sort of prompting the user for their business policies. And so via the API, you can create, update, delete, and as I said before, business policies are a requirement for the new inventory API. So eBay Guaranteed Delivery, you can opt in via the API. You will be able to get the existing rate tables, shipping rate tables from the API and associate it with the business policies. But creating and modifying for now happen in the eBay UI. Right. Eventually, the idea is to eventually be able to create and modify as well in the API. So that's on the roadmap. A note about sales tax. So in the US, Canada, and India, we do have sales tax tables, and we use those tables to calculate tax at the time of transaction in those countries. So, for example, in the US, you can set a different tax rate for every state. And that's live today and available via the account API. We have some partners who have built UIs against that as part of the onboarding flow. It is a step that some sellers don't even know exists. So it is a great call out in your onboarding flows to say, hey, if you want to collect taxes on eBay, here's how you do it. You can do it all via API. Quick note about VAT and GST at the bottom here. There aren't any requirements that you can really satisfy via API, but there are some recommendations we can give to sellers in VAT and GST countries. For example, we have a form online for requesting exemption from VAT and GST on your seller fees, which they don't want to get a surprise 10% on top of their seller fees that they're already paying 10%. So it might be beneficial to make those recommendations to your sellers, even though we can't manage it via API today. All right, store subscriptions will save sellers money. I'm going to give you a bit of a pitch about store subscriptions. It's about saving money, but it's also the branding opportunity. I know I've talked to some of you in the last couple of days about branding and how important it is for our sellers to tell their story, and stores are the best way to do that on eBay today. So if you remember in an earlier step, we captured whether they were a store subscriber or not. In our example here, we're checking to see if it is true or false. And if they haven't subscribed to a store yet, we recommend driving them towards our store subscriptions page. And just for an example of how store subscriptions can save a seller money, this is an example of how the seller could save over $600 per month. If they have 1,000 listings, they do $10,000 in sales. Without a store subscription, they would pay over $1,200. If they had a premium store subscription, they'd get 0 insertion fees, they'd get discounted final value fees, and even though they're paid $60 in the subscription fee, they're still only paying $674, right? So that's an example of sellers could save money, which hopefully will get them to be more successful on eBay, and we all succeed. All right, so since we were talking about stores, I thought I would show you the Bula shoe store from my original example. So you can see they've got the great banner image, their logo. They get to select featured items that they display, and they're doing pretty well on eBay now. All right, so a word about seller limits. So those who don't know, seller limits are a way that eBay sort of limits their risk exposure. So new sellers, when they come on, will have relatively low limits, and then we increase their selling limits over time. And limits are on the number of items and the total dollar value of those items. And so we recommend that sellers register as a business because in the U.S. today and soon in UK and Australia, and also with some other programmatic things we're doing, with the registering as a business will get you higher seller limits on day one. So if you recall, in one of the earlier steps when we got the account info, we pulled down what a seller's seller limits are. The reason we did that is because there are some things you can do to sort of avoid crashing into the limits bridge, right? So if they have seller limits of 500 items and they are trying to upload a catalog of 1,000 items, they're going to hit an error on the last half of their listings, right? And so we can avoid that experience by taking the seller limits and comparing it to the catalog or the selection of inventory that they're trying to upload to make sure they're not going to hit them. If they're staying below their limits, great, don't need to do anything. Go ahead and create the listings. But if they are going to exceed their limits, it's a better user experience to call that out ahead of time, right? As opposed to hitting errors and then saying, oh my gosh, this thing is broken, what's wrong here? Be far better to call that out ahead of time. And we have a URL that we can send them to request higher limits. Okay, so getting inventory into the right category is critical. I've had a number of conversations with you guys about this over the last couple of days too. We have access to, obviously our whole taxonomy is available via API. We also have an API for getting suggested categories. If you don't know which category you're going to be inserting products into, you can call our get suggested category with keywords and we'll return a response for you that you can use to get items in the right category. But it's not 100% accurate, but that's why we really recommend using GTINs if possible to get items into the right category. If you have the UPC and it's in our eBay catalog, you've got 100% hit there. We're going to get it in the right category, and that's going to help with conversion, and it's going to help with SEO as well. So use GTINs where you can. If you can't, there are some other things that you can do to try and mitigate it. I put some sample use cases together just as talking points more than anything. But for example, if you've got a platform or a large seller with a fixed taxonomy that doesn't really change, you can map that taxonomy to the eBay taxonomy ahead of time, right? You don't have to rely on get suggested categories or even the UPCs. If your categories can be mapped to eBay categories, great, you're off to the races. If you have a platform where the seller defines their own taxonomy, then as I said before, we can use get suggested categories to find the right category. So number 3 is kind of the same as number 2, but the recommendation here is, and I've seen some platforms do this, they'll ask the user during the setup flow, hey, what are the top 5 categories that you list in? And they give them the eBay taxonomy to choose from. This helps inform them and sense check the response from get suggested categories, right? So they, the example I used that unfortunately I've seen in the wild was men's shoes, and they used some keywords that included men's, and the response from get suggested categories was specimens, because it ends in men's. But they had prompted the user ahead of time for, hey, what categories are you selling in? And so they knew, hey, this is a shoe seller. That's not the right category to put it in. We're going to put it in men's shoes. So creating inventory. This is the last step. We can get through all this other stuff. We can create inventory. This is the goal, right? We're not going to get orders until we've created inventory. So again, there are, this is usually where we crash into errors, right? When we're starting to create the inventory items. So we recommend doing some pre-validation where you can on inventory. There's some obvious stuff, right? You got to make sure they have images, they have titles, they have descriptions. But there's some less obvious stuff too around item specifics, and that really depends on the category they're listing in, right? There may be, you know, if they're selling in a men's clothing category, then you're going to need men's size, right? Or women's size and women's category. You can check ahead of time before crashing into the errors and make sure they've got those item specifics and create better user experiences on entering that information before you even try and list to eBay. So again, listing against the eBay catalog, if you've got the G10s, again, if it's in our catalog, we've got all of those item specifics already. We've got images, we've got titles, we've got descriptions. You can choose to use them, or you can choose to enter your own. It's really easy via the new inventory API to create listings with very little information if it's in our catalog. Just a few words about error handling. Even if you do everything that I've recommended here, you're still going to hit errors. It's just going to happen, right? So we want to handle them, make sure you handle them gracefully. The error messages from our APIs are usually pretty descriptive, and you can figure out what you need to do, and sometimes you can present those directly to the users. But some platforms choose, and some of the errors we give could be improved. So you can actually interpret some of these errors for users and direct them. The goal really with error handling is to direct them to a path to rectifying it, right? So that was kind of our seller journey, and hopefully if we follow all of these steps, the quote will not be, wow, that was hard. It will be, wow, that was easy for onboarding.